Hi, everybody. It's Deirdre Fay, and I am so glad to be here talking with Sunil Lad, who I've known for years as part of the compassion focused therapy world and community that I belong to as well. And Sunil brings a tremendous amount of understanding about transforming suffering into compassion from his own life and also with his work in prisons. But he understands about racism. He understands about dwarfism and being a small person. He knows these really intimately and how to work with and encounter life. One of the powerful things about Sunil is he has taken all this personal work and adapted it and integrated in his work in the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, where he works in Northamptonshire, and his work in the prisons. And I just have so much deep respect for you for that and many more. And also, we're deep companions on the journey of integrating yoga philosophy and the psychology of yoga into our work. So, Sunil, I'm just here to listen to you and be part of the experience.
Oh, thank you, Deirdre. So it's always amazing to talk to you, and thank you for creating this space, really. And I think this has come at a really timely time in terms of what's happening in the world right now. So it's felt quite strange, kind of being locked up at home. So not necessarily being physically in the prisons at the moment, because I can't see the men that I work with, because generally prisons are on minimal regime at the moment. So doing things from afar, but then just watching the news has been really powerful. And the Black Lives Matter movement, and it's just got me thinking and feeling so much. I think, thinking about my own experiences, what this has been another shining light for, or just looking in the mirrors, not only what have I experienced, but also the other side of things. So I guess I see myself in quite a privileged position to, whilst, like you said, I've faced suffering in my life in many different guises. At the same time, I think I probably overused my drive system, where I've gone and pushed myself to go and become a doctor and do all sorts of qualifications and go and decide to work in prisons for some reason. And really push myself to my limits, really. But I guess within that, I haven't at times always looked at the suffering that I've experienced. And I think it just kind of, the layers start to unpeel themselves. And I think, this last month, I've just felt physically exhausted in seeing things, and that sort of sometimes triggered own experiences I've had, but then also holding space for others. That's been really humbling and powerful, to recognize that everyone's experienced suffering in many different ways. And I think what's really been powerful is seeing the different responses to this whole pandemic, and to suffering. And it's reminding me, especially, so I work in various prisons, and one of the prisons I do work in is a large prison with sex offenders. And one of the things that I'm seeing at the moment is quite similar behavior that I see in the men, what we're seeing with the media at times and those in power. So a lot of deflection, blame, minimization, avoidance, all of those kind of experiences. And that's been really frustrating, because that's caused a big division, because then we go kind of to our tribal mentalities. And it was funny. It's like, how do those people that really annoy me, that really get me angry, how can I recognize they're also part of me?
Yes.
And I think there's something about social media, which kind of, I've tried to take myself off social media, because you kind of get into a rabbit hole of getting things, watching things that just make you feel so angry. And I think the most compassionate thing that I've been doing over the last week is just stepping back from it. And I think it's about then, when I step back from it, how can I sit in suffering? How can I recognize that those people who are really pushing this might really be struggling with how do they sit in their own suffering? How they might feel really uncomfortable with shame for experiences that they never decided, they might not have, well, they didn't have a choice to necessarily be white or black. And as a result, how can we recognize that, yes, we didn't have a choice, but how do we take responsibility at this moment in time to change those things? And that's what I say to the men that I've worked with who have committed heinous crimes. It's not your fault you were born with a certain family, in a certain environment, and therefore those experiences led you to do those behaviors. However, it's your responsibility now to change this.
I want to circle back to something you said in the beginning. You talked about how your drive system actually helped propel you forward and learn and develop yourself, and in some ways to exhaustion. The drive brought you to exhaustion where you weren't even aware of the amount of suffering that you were in. And it intrigues me because, having lived in an ashram, I know how so many of us have used spiritual practices to use our drive system, our spiritual drive system, to jump over the complexities of being a human being. And it sounds like now what you're doing is you're having to sit with the suffering itself and having to learn a new way of being in relationship to the suffering.
Yeah, and you just saying that, Deirdre, has reminded me of when that journey kind of changed for me. So whilst I've been working in prisons for about 16 years or 17 years now, actually yoga only came into my life in the last few years. So whilst I've been in my drive system, basically I was working and getting myself to a point of exhaustion. And that's when things started to change. So a few years ago, I went on the Compassion Focus retreat in Thailand with Chris Irons and started just kind of getting deeper into the CFT practices. And then once I started so I'd just been vaguely introduced to yoga. I went to a few classes and it was like, okay, this is quite nice, a bit of exercise, just move my body this way, that way, it's quite nice. And then after the CFT retreat I kind of went on this exploration of different retreats. So I was like, oh, this retreat feels good. I need to start thinking about myself. It's making me feel good. And then I went on a yoga retreat for a week. And then things just started to change. Then I kind of randomly met the yoga teacher who then did my yoga teacher training a year or two afterwards, because I went to India. And it's strange because whilst I'm from an Indian background, yoga was never part of my heritage in a way. And then suddenly I start doing these practices and hearing these words that were around me. And it just felt right, just chanting and just singing. And it was like, okay, this felt weird when I was growing up, but I feel so in tune with it now. And it's helping me it's just shifting my body, really. And then it helped me to get deeper into the asanas, the physical postures. And it's kind of, ever since my yoga teacher training about 2.5 years ago, things have just drastically changed. And now, since my yoga teacher training, sitting in my body feels very different, but also the embodied experience I have in my therapeutic practice is totally different. So now I read my clients in terms of when they're sitting with their big armor, I can recognize that. I can say, oh, this looks like you're struggling. Let's really focus on your breath. Because
so what do you think it was, Sunil, well, first of all, going on retreat is often a wonderful way to have a wedge into our experience and create shift. But there's something, it almost sounds, I don't want to use the word magical, but something alchemical came out of it that was different. That really, you knew the CFT world in your head, but somehow you then deepened into your own body, and then the experience of exploring how to be in a body became more clear. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, totally. So I guess, thinking about my training as a psychologist, you've got to, in a way, have your shit together. And you kind of, yes, you go to therapy and you have some self-exploration, but you generally don't start to share that with yourself. You share it in supervision, but it's a very contained space. And the teacher training that I went to was really intense. When you go on retreat, you start being in a space where everyone is just sharing all sorts of experiences, all their suffering that they've kind of trapped within their body, because it starts to come out. If we think about what Bessel van der Kolk says about how the body remembers, and I think, within psychology training, we very much get stuck in the head. We try and intellectualize things.
Right.
Whereas the yoga teacher training really helped me to embody things, embody my suffering, and really sit with it. All those messages, especially as a man, that you've got to be strong, you can't be vulnerable, without realizing. And it's been really interesting, even when I've done various practices in the CFT world, when I started to get into it, we got into, with Karina and Chris, we went into this embodiment practice, and we were moving around, and I was nearly sick. And what I felt that was related to was kind of aspects of work that I've done, really getting into, graphic details of people's offences, which were full of violence and other things. And I just kind of just switched off from it. And then these things started to come out. So I think as therapists, we sometimes don't also recognize that, because we get stuck in the head.
It's so true. And I think you're also pointing to the importance of our common humanity, that if we don't hear or aren't part of an environment where people recognize we all suffer, that it's inescapable, that somehow we hide that from ourselves, and we actually get ashamed that we're suffering in one form or another. But it sounds like there was something for you that happened when you dropped in and actually embodied the work, that opened up your heart and allowed you to be more connected in a different way. I'm so curious what the effect was then on the work that you did in the prisons after that. Did you notice a difference in your being and how the men in the prisons responded to you?
Yeah, I felt like I was taking more kind of therapeutic risks. It wasn't like I was treading on eggshells. And I think my clients picked up on that. So they were also getting me to go to deeper and darker places because they felt safe. So there was something about me which felt safe within my body, which they were picking up on. Because I guess one of the things that I really recognize is that, especially for the men that I work with, they've experienced all sorts of abuse throughout their life. So actually just sitting in the room with another human being is extremely threatening. So one of the things that I'm conscious of is that because of my height, they don't see me as a threat. So they can go and access a part of them which feels safe. But I guess because I've historically been concerned about my own safety, I've kind of held back.
Oh, isn't that fascinating?
And I've only started to recognize that now, really.
I think I'm going to cry, to get that your height, which I'm sure we've never really talked about it, but I'm sure it's created a lot of suffering. that could actually be a gift in this circumstance. It's like,
Mhm.
you know, um,
And yeah, I think that's what I've only been sitting with in the last year or two. Previously, I think it felt as though it was a curse at times. But then the deeper I've gone into these practices, it's just felt, no, I can make a positive difference. I can use it to my advantage. I can use it to help and transform others' suffering because I've been and understood my own suffering in a way. And there's something about, if we think about the philosophy of yoga, if we think about the yamas and the niyams, there's something about how do we sit in ahimsa, in non-violence. And again, for me, non-violence is the opposite is self-critical thoughts. And that is something that we've all had. And especially in therapy, we often talk about, well, actually recognize your self-criticism. And I think we spoke about this some time ago now. How do we see compassion as a motivation, as non-violence, as ahimsa?
Say more. Keep going with that, Sunil.
So if we're rooted and we're living in our lives in a compassionate motivation, how we see the world is not through our threat systems. So we're not seeing all the danger, which means that when our threat system is on, we respond to the world with caution in all sorts of ways. And I've recognized that I've done that. I've avoided places, kind of looked down, not looked at people thinking, oh God, they're looking at me, all of those type of things. Whereas I've got that compassionate motivation now. And there was something about, I think, where the switch really happened for me was on the yoga teacher training that I went to. We had a day on each chakra, and on the day of the heart chakra, kind of, we were in this practice and I just burst out crying, because what came out for me was forgiveness to myself for the fact that I didn't want to address my body.
Oh.
And I think it's about recognition of, we live in a world where we get certain messages, whether that's from our family, whether that's from society, whether that's from the environment. And I guess there's something about, again, our threat system, those tribal mentalities, that any kind of difference, people are very cautious of. And our brain goes into various ways of thinking, those tribal mentalities. And that's when we've seen all that suffering come out. But I guess, I see that suffering as something that is positive, that can transform us into whole different things, which is really exciting at the moment, because it feels like parts of the world are really listening.
Say more, Sunil.
So it feels like, we're having these conversations. I think it's some people are really scared about these conversations, hence all the focus on, let's stop thinking about defunding the police and all of those kind of things. But actually it's about, how do we, because we've had a world where there's huge inequality. If we think about how much we consume, the coronavirus has really taught me quite a lot in terms of, how much do I really need to consume? How often do I need to go to the supermarkets and buy food? And, I've got it down to, I need to go once every 2 weeks. And I think we live in this world of consumerism where we like it quick. But actually, if we look at nature doesn't tell us to do those kind of things. And as a result, those kind of karmas, in a way, have built up to show us, you need to stop harming the planet, you need to stop harming yourselves. That's why we've got all these illnesses and stuff, because we're not tending to nature, we're not listening to our bodies. What we've got is that we want to switch off from that suffering. So we've seen people drink alcohol, take drugs, and I see that in the work that I do. That's when, you know, you go over the edge because you've learned to just switch off. Whether that's even in the yoga world of spiritual bypassing. And there's many different ways to do that, isn't there?
We all have our own particular, unique, beloved form.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, again, it's about not only how can we first start off with our own suffering, and then how can we support the suffering of others? How can we grow from our own suffering in order to help others?
And what you're saying, which feels so true to me, is we have to first encounter and engage with our own suffering.
Yeah. And that's tough. If we don't have the skills or the support or the background around us to be able to do that, or that knowledge and understanding.
Right. I was just reading somebody who's getting certified in the Becoming Safely Embodied skills, and she was writing about how threatening those body sensations can be unless we learn how to actually make contact with them, have enough space in our skin to hold them so they can move. Otherwise, we get trapped in them, and we ruminate, we get lost in them, we get overwhelmed by them. I think, you know, one of the things you've touched on is the integration of CFT and yoga. And, you know, in CFT, we look at the 3 different drive systems of threat. There's threat and there's drive, and then there's the caregiving. And what you had to do is really rework those 3, and how then yoga then helped you access really your caregiving system within yourself, and then therefore allowed compassion to flow more easily outside of yourself.
Yeah, which goes back to the 3 flows of compassion.
Yes. Wait, say that so if people aren't familiar with that.
So if we think about the 3 flows of compassion, it's self to self, other to self, and self to other. So we can flow in compassion in many different ways. And I guess, you know, we can have different flows of compassion from different so for me, my yoga practice, my breath can be breathing in compassion and really feeling it opening out my heart, and then allowing me to support others. And what's been really interesting for me during lockdown is that because of lockdown, it's given me a chance to teach asana and yoga to my friends and my family. It's been a beautiful way to connect. And I've not reckoned, so it's quite weird how I've kind of weaved in bits of therapy and yoga philosophy. And actually what it's really allowed me to do is really understand how yoga philosophy overlaps with CFT principles.
That's phenomenal. And I agree that they do. There's a wonderful merging between them. And I think there's also a place where we then get to deepen into the felt experience. You know, CFT is one of the most astoundingly researched and understanding of compassion. You know, we also, like, what is it like to live in a body, and how does compassion flow from within on a felt experience, not as a conceptual thing.
Yeah. And I guess that goes back to the fact that we also are really disembodied.
Or we become disembodied, right, out of the threat system.
Out of the threat system, but also because of how we've been kind of brought up. You know, I was listening to Darcia Navarro, who spoke a few years ago at the CFT conference, and she talked about the evolved nest and going back to nature in terms of how our ancestors were living. And in a way, we're not living in those tribes, you know, raising a child, all of those kind of things. You know, kind of parents have to go to work and it's really tough. So they're juggling and so also parents don't want to control their children rather than teach their child how to really be truly embodied. What's really exciting for me is that I've been doing yoga with my nieces and nephews as well. So actually, how can they start to learn about their bodies from a very young age as well?
Oh, what a gift. Well, Sunil, I know we've taken a lot of time and I loved it. Loved it. You bring me into my heart, and the connection that you glow with and radiate with is such a wonderful gift to all of us. So thank you.
No, thank you. It's been always amazing to spend time with you, Deirdre.